Hi everyone, speaking to you once again from here in Nova Scotia. So hello and welcome to week 4 of How to Live Like Socrates. So this is the final webinar and there's quite a lot to cram in this week actually, so I think we're probably going to it'll take about an hour. I'm going to go through some things quite quickly because looking at the content there's a lot to cover, lots of comments from you guys on the week 3 content, so I want to try and just kind of acknowledge those. If you haven't already, just say where you're watching from and say hello in the live chat area. Just confirm that you can see and hear me okay. Also let me know if there's any buffering in the video. There shouldn't be, and sometimes that can be at your end in your connection, but let me know if the video is coming through okay and stuff. It's generally okay. Okay, so having done the introductions, some general housekeeping stuff I'm going to do next. Then I'll recap, as usual, last week, the week 3 stuff about justice and friendship. And then I'll do a preview of what's coming next, which is the week 4 content about courage and death. And I've had some feedback forms, and feedback's all very positive, and there's a couple of kind of questions or whatever. Probably not going to respond to those today. I might write something and send out a response later. So for example, somebody said it would be good if there were questions and answers at the end of the video. Actually, we do have that, but on the recent ones nobody's posted any questions that I've noticed anyway. So at the end of this video, if anybody wants to ask any questions, just put @Donald in the live chat and I'll try to take time and answer your questions, and I'll check in occasionally and see if I notice any as well, and hopefully we can do a bit of that as well. So again, there's a little bit of a delay. I think it's about 30 seconds on the video compared to the chat, and remember that if you want to, you can also pause the live stream. There'll be a video that goes up permanently at the end of this as well, and you can comment underneath that if you're watching the recording, and again just say hi and where you're from and stuff. It's always nice to see where people are watching from and things. Okay, so updates. All of the week 4 content is up apart from one article about the trial of Socrates, which I'm probably going to upload later on today, but pretty much everything else is up there now. Quizzes, make sure you do the quizzes. Like, I think they really reinforce the learning, and actually going through the discussion, some of the questions that people have, I think you'd probably partially answer some of those questions, or I think it would benefit you, like just looking at some of the discussions, to do the quiz questions. I think it would kind of get you engaging a little bit more with some of the content and kind of picking out some of the key areas. So do take time to do those. It doesn't take very long. There's only about a dozen questions in each quiz. Also, make sure you post comments if you haven't been doing that much. Go back and look at the previous comments. There are now a lot of comments. I'll respond to the majority of comments that people make, and we currently have, let's see, live 280 comments have been posted, so it's quite a lot. You might not have seen all of those if you're going through the course a little bit quicker than other people. In additions, there will be more additions. You all have lifetime access, so you're going to benefit from that. And I'm probably going to do some other videos which are a secret, but I'm going to be doing some pretty exciting stuff hopefully later in the year, and then you'll all get to see that and it'll be of benefit to you. And there's a couple of areas that I haven't covered in this version of the course I'm going to add in later. So this course is going to get slightly bigger, although there's quite a lot of content in it already. Okay, so week 3, I'm going to go through this fairly quickly because there's a lot of discussion. I don't know, like maybe people are kind of just building up to week 3 and getting progressively more engaged, or it may be the content just triggered more discussion for some reason. So there are discussion areas in the pilot version under most of the videos and articles, And in subsequent versions of the course, I tend to reduce the number of discussions, so they're kind of more focused on specific areas. So we're kind of spread a little bit more thinly at the moment. The video on Socrates and friendship in the memorabilia, Wilfred had said he can understand why it's harder to count friends than it is to count sheep. Yeah, I mean, the point that Socrates is basically making there is that when you ask people about who they identify as a friend, usually you can tell that people are like, I haven't really thought about this, and just asking them the question will tend to encourage them to engage in more cognitive restructuring and to think more carefully about what it is that makes somebody a friend and doesn't. It's just a cognitive trick in a sense. Like the same as putting ratings on things. It's a very common strategy in cognitive therapy. It tends to work very well, like with the majority of people. It allows you to pose questions that encourage people to reevaluate things. So yeah, the financial value that Socrates puts on relationships, he's not planning to sell his friends, right? That's not the point. Like, the point is that actually he's encouraging his friends to reevaluate their own qualities as a friend. It's a trick to encourage people to think more deeply about whether they're a good friend or not. He talks about how some friendships are priceless, and then some are more like kind of acquaintances, and what that tells us about how good a friend we're being to other people. But I think just mentioning money kind of sends people off a tangent a little bit, maybe. But I think, honestly, if you think about that more deeply, it is a useful analogy. Don't kind of get diverted by stuff about slavery and things. That's not what he's talking about, really. Wilfred says, surprised that friendship is a major part of discussing justice. It's kind of indirectly connected, but there's a lot of stuff about friendship in Socrates and other Greek philosophers as well. It's incredibly important to them. It's particularly important to Socrates, and it relates to justice. I think maybe what helps to explain that a little bit, I think I tried to explain this at the beginning of this week. Maybe I need to kind of emphasize it a bit more. Justice perhaps isn't the best translation of the word dikaiosune, the Greek word that describes this virtue. And also, if you think about ancient justice, it's kind of a broader concept than the more formalized idea of justice that we have today. So in the Victorian era, for example, and even to some extent today, that Greek word may be translated as righteousness or uprightness, and sometimes that works better in other contexts. So it's a slightly, these things are never going to line up perfectly with English words. It's a slightly broader concept. So for example, the Greeks talk about this being a virtue that a mother would exhibit in running the household and interacting with her children. So that's less formal than what we would normally think of as justice, perhaps. And part of it is beneficence and helping other people, showing kindness towards other people, which is obviously closely tied in with what we think of as friendship, whereas the kind of impartiality of justice maybe doesn't quite square with thinking about friendship. But we're essentially talking about the virtues that are, so we're talking about social virtue. We're talking about the virtues that are exhibited in our relationships, both individually and collectively. And so that's really where it ties into friendship. Brenda had mentioned, surprised there's not more mention of the importance of family. I think as you kind of go through week 3, though, you'll have seen in the other sections that he does talk quite a lot about family in relation to friendship. For example, in the discussion we'll get to in a moment about Socrates, and also with Lamprocles, his eldest son. There are several places where he puts a lot of value in family relationships as well. So you've probably seen that already anyway. The next video is the one about Socrates. Melville said Socrates' emphasis on friendship is psychologically important. Yeah, and I'm glad you noticed that, because again, what I find is that some people think, well, this seems more philosophical than psychological. I might kind of recalibrate the content a little bit to kind of bring that out, but to me immediately this is all about psychology as well as philosophy. As soon as we're talking about relationships, we're talking about psychology, we're talking about friendship, we're talking about the way that we interact with other people, we're talking about anger management as well, which isn't something, maybe that I brought out as much as I would have liked. Maybe I'll go back and add stuff to kind of try and pull that out a little bit more. But anger isn't something that Socrates talks about that much explicitly. In later philosophers, it's more obvious that these things are all kind of interconnected, for Socratic philosophers anyway. So yeah, definitely the stuff on friendship is very psychologically important, resonates with me as a therapist, and the stuff about justice as well, to me, is very much resonates with the stuff that I would do in anger management. The next section was a video about Critobulus, the son of Crito, and how to earn friendship and this kind of double standard strategy. Chris had said that he was enjoying all the week 3 content, and he didn't realise that Socrates got into the sort of nitty gritty of this kind of content about our behaviour rather than more academic stuff. Yeah, ancient philosophy in general is much more down to earth in that respect. Philosophy became academic, partly because of the academics, the Platonists, and scholastic. Like over time, it became more bookish over time. But early Greek philosophers, particularly Socrates, saw philosophy as a form of self-improvement. They describe it as like a medicine. They use the word therapy, therapia, to describe it. And so sometimes it's interesting, you'll see even modern philosophers saying these therapists, they come along and they're trying to hijack philosophy and turn it into a self-improvement thing. Duh, it always was. Socrates like conceptualized it in that way right from the outset. Even before that, Pythagoras obviously conceptualized philosophy as something like a therapeutic process. Like there wasn't the kind of separation between these things that we have today, the sort of division of labour between philosophy and psychotherapy. They were intertwined in Greek philosophy. So in Socrates, also partly because he didn't deliver lectures, he didn't write books, his style of philosophy is much more engaging with real people and talking about real problems. And inevitably, when we get the dialogues, it becomes kind of slightly more generalised. But if you look at what his friends, particularly Xenophon, say about him, you know, they say, no, Socrates was talking to random people in the street and helping them solve their problems in everyday life by using the Socratic method. He wasn't like a professor or a lecturer. Michael said he also likes this kind of material, discussing conflicts, practical issues, stuff like that. Good. Wilfred said he wasn't as keen on that particular dialogue because he thought it seemed obvious that it's better to deserve friends than to deceive them. As a therapist, I can't emphasize enough how I've had endless discussions with people where it wasn't obvious to them at all, and the conversation that Socrates is having with Critobulus is just exactly the sort of conversation that therapists have every day with their clients. And so even if it's obvious to you, it might be useful to think maybe it's not obvious to like half the people that are around me that they would think about their relationships in this way. Definitely not. You know, just asking very simple double standard questions usually frazzles people, or even if they think it's obvious to them, you can see that they haven't. You can tell when someone hasn't thought something through, and you posing questions to them and they're kind of, the contradictions are coming out, like with the Socratic method, or they're getting kind of stuck trying to answer things. So Socrates basically would take that almost like a sign. It's like a symptom that, you know, some work needs to be done in clarifying, introducing more consistency to our thinking, because it's thinking about practical stuff. The next section, which I might turn into a video at some point, is in the Lysis on friendship. Another early Maieutic dialogue. So you'll notice they're very different in style from the kind of advice that Socrates sometimes gives, the more practical dialogues and Xenophon's notes. So this is a classic piece of Socratic midwifery. You've seen that in Charmides, you'll see it in the Laches as well, that's coming up. And so there's kind of going circling around the issue, not really arriving at a clear conclusion. But in all these Maieutic dialogues, you'll find that this kind of spiraling, although it may seem inconclusive, when you then see the advice that Socrates gives, you'll notice he's drawing on the same concepts often. So, you know, they're not just irrelevant non-answers or whatever. He is kind of getting closer to the essence of the virtue that he's examining. He's drawing on these ideas elsewhere in his discussions with people when he's being a little bit more direct to them. A good example of that would be in the Apology, where he's really talking about his own philosophy of life, and but nevertheless you can see him kind of referring to some of these similar concepts. So you do need to, when you're going into these early dialogues, you know, not get frustrated because it doesn't arrive at a clear answer. That's not the idea. It's meant to encourage you to think for yourself, so it's deliberately inconclusive. Chris says there's some great points in it. It seems to confuse love and friendship. Yeah, I always want to kind of talk about this a lot more, but it would take ages, so I'm just going to touch on it briefly. Some of that's down to translation, some of it's probably deliberate, some of it's cultural differences. When you read that dialogue in particular, you kind of have to wrestle with Greek pederasty, and this is a theme in Greek philosophy, particularly Socrates, to some extent in the Stoics as well, and it's quite an alien concept in many ways from our perspective. So I always find there's a real effort required to kind of wrap your head around the sort of relationships that they're talking about here, and the values that kind of go hand in hand with them as well. But I don't want to get lost in the weeds discussing that too much. But there is a blurring of the boundary that we would normally think of between lovers and friends in certain contexts in Greek philosophy. That's certainly the case. Bob says, seems like overthinking friendship. I guess what I'd say about that again is I'd go back to the example. The point in a way of Socrates' question about how many friends have you got? Like, would the shepherd know how many sheep he has? Well, how come nobody can tell you how many friends they have, or they're not really sure? You ask them, they start to reconsider whether somebody really is a friend or not. The point of that anecdote is, it says, look, it's really easy to show that most people have underthought friendship, right? And Socrates says we should remedy this. We should be thinking more about friendship. We should be talking more about the nature of friendship. That can only benefit us. So, and the questions he raises, funnily enough, although sometimes people may find it frustrating, when you list them out, they're really kind of simple, fundamental questions. Does like attract like? Do opposites attract? Can you have one-way friendships? So, like, does it necessarily have to be a mutual thing? You know, do friends somehow benefit each other? Like, and then are we treating people as fair weather friends, or like using them as if they were objects? These are really, he actually kind of hits the nail on the head. There's some pretty fundamental questions about friendship, I think. Wilfred says he's not sure, but friendship is part of justice because we have control over justice, but friends come and go. Yeah, but he's talking about the part of it that we do have control over. So, you know, he's interested in the way that we behave as a friend, regardless of whether friends come and go. And even if you're on a desert island, like Socrates kind of hints at this. He doesn't really, as far as I remember, draw it out very explicitly. Maybe he does somewhere. He touches on it in that dialogue, actually. The idea that the concept of friendship also extends to our relationship with ourselves. So even if you're on a desert island, there's still the question of, and this is also a very profound question, to what extent do we act like friends towards ourselves? You'd think, you know, that would be an important thing in life, and we would do it a lot. If we're not acting like friends to ourselves, are we acting like enemies towards ourselves? Like, there's some really simple fundamental questions there that I think are definitely worth wrestling with. The next video is about Polemarchus. I've kind of forgotten that we get into the Republic, actually. Week 3 is kind of my favourite week. Maybe I think I mentioned that in the last webinar. And particularly book 1 of the Republic I'm kind of obsessed with. It was one of the first things that I read by Socrates, and I kind of remembered it for the rest of my life. Not verbatim, but I remember the themes and bits of it. So Polemarchus, this thing about helping our friends and harming our enemies. there are still plenty of people that think that way today, and it was a traditional concept that Greeks seem to have been familiar with. It would be a instinctive answer that they seem to give in response to questions about the nature of justice, and it's kind of basically the law of retaliation, lex talionis, like an eye for an eye. And again, that makes us think Socrates is preempting Christian ethics in some ways here. The Christian idea of forgiveness, for example, turning the other cheek and stuff like that. There's a kind of similarity 400 years earlier. So Wilfred says he likes the notion of justice as do no harm. In Buddhism and Hinduism and Jainism, it's known as ahimsa. Most world religions probably have this idea of not doing harm, and that leads me off at another tangent, which is sometimes when people read these philosophers, I find this with Stoicism as well, and people say this seems idealistic, or it seems like a crazy idea, or stuff like that. It's like they can't envisage somebody even attempting to embrace this as a way of life. Then I think it is useful in that context to say, hang on a minute, slow down, let's think about the extent to which this resembles stuff like Christianity, because although you might say nobody's ever lived up to Christian ideals perfectly, nevertheless, there are millions of people that have attempted to do so over the space of 2,000 years. It's not a crazy idea like that someone would turn the other cheek or be forgiving towards their enemies. So is it any crazier really when we look at what Socrates is suggesting? I think the comparisons with religion are useful in that respect to normalise some of these ideas so that they don't seem as kind of abstract or as weird. Other people say similar things. Brenda said, how can we justify war if we're helping our enemies? Yeah, again, that makes me think of comparisons with other world religions and Christianity and stuff. I guess like part of the answer to that would be that sometimes a good analogy would be with children. Like some people might say, well, that you might have to punish children, like not so much today but in the past people might have thought of that as not really harming them but actually being done for their benefit. There might be contexts in which we have to punish criminals and we're not doing it just to harm them but for their benefit. So paradoxically as a means to actually helping rather than harming. The article on Justice is the Interest of the Stronger by Thrasymachus, or in discussion with Thrasymachus. Again, another whole can of worms, so I'm probably just going to touch on it a little bit, just kind of acknowledge some of the questions. Again, like one of the bits that I really love. I feel like the sophists come out of that dialogue badly. I kind of feel sorry for them a little bit. Maybe do we redeem that later? I can't remember what comes up next now, but there are other dialogues where the sophists come out of it looking better. In this particular dialogue, the sophist that Socrates is talking to, Thrasymachus, just seems kind of grumpy and aggressive and cynical with a small c, I would say. But he also says some things that have some validity to them and are kind of interesting. I can't emphasize enough how I find it uncanny the extent to which this part of the dialogue, to me, seems to mirror conversations I see people having online all over the place today. There seems to me to be a lot of people that are cynical about politics and ethics in the way that Thrasymachus is, that think of it really as just about self-interest, very sceptical about the whole idea of justice. They think it's just a social construct that's kind of being foisted on us. And this is something Socrates was dealing with his students 2,500 years ago, and felt that there are ways, whether you agree with him or not, he felt it was worth questioning that. Melville says Thrasymachus has his reputation at stake. Yeah, that's part of it. Winning arguments takes priority over the truth for the sophists. Brenda, Thrasymachus is describing the truth about how things are in society. Yeah, but Socrates is saying, I guess, that doesn't mean that you should teach young Athenian aristocrats to think that way. Also think of the wider social picture here. This is stuff he's teaching these kids to think. As a Socrates, it's kind of like a part of it is Thrasymachus is corrupting the youth, the thing that Socrates was put on trial for, and he's aware of that. You know, he's thinking, these kids shouldn't be listening to this guy, like, because one day they are going to be politicians running the state, and is this really how we want them thinking about life? Then there's an article that follows on from that with Thrasymachus talking this idea about injustice as self-interest. The kind of subtext here is that Socrates is associated with the idea of the four cardinal virtues. Some of the sophists appear to have questioned that or rejected it, which, you know, in some ways may have been part of why they were controversial. In some ways, I think the sophists and some other philosophers were celebrities, partly in the way that some modern thinkers who are contrarians are. They were saying stuff that appealed to people, but it was also shocking and sensational and radical. And Thrasymachus, I think, comes across like that. You know, everybody kind of would be interested in what he's saying, and he would potentially have got himself into a little bit of trouble maybe by saying some of those things. So he's a kind of contrarian in a way. He would attract attention that way. And really what he's kind of saying is that he thinks wisdom and courage are virtues, but he's not so sure about justice. He doesn't mention self-control, but if I remember rightly, some of the sophists questioned whether self-control was really a virtue as well. He seems to kind of mainly be questioning whether justice is a real virtue, though. And then Socrates part of his angle on that is, as you'll see, he believes there are inconsistencies between teaching that wisdom is something that we should aspire to and trying to combine that with injustice. Like, so Socrates says, whoa, hang on a minute, on closer inspection, how are you defining these two concepts so that they're not contradictory? This is the very abbreviated version. Michael, Thrasymachus is morally bankrupt. Diogenes the Cynic taught that poverty, real poverty, paradoxically, is the desire to have everything, even by violent means. Socrates would agree with that paradox. He would say the tyrant, who Thrasymachus admires, idealizes, is the weakest and most impoverished man in the world, ironically. So this guy who's kind of believes in strength and is teaching his students to be strong men, Socrates ironically thinks is a moral weakling. Interesting paradox. Wilfred, best discussion so far on the thread. Surprised the discussion's still relevant. Do we need debates of this kind? In a just society, everyone's a winner. Yeah, it's totally still relevant. Go on the internet. You know, it's full of people saying they think justice is nonsense and it's for suckers, and like, you know, it's really all boils down to self-interest and stuff. They're the children of Thrasymachus, you know, they surround us. And there are self-improvement gurus. Some people may be not aware of this. My background as a trainer in psychotherapy exposed me to the breadth of these things. My students would have read, I'm not going to name individual authors or trainers, but they picked up ideas like this. And again, because they're contrarian, you know, people make a living out of teaching this stuff. And also, Nietzsche, it's often been observed, in some ways resembles Thrasymachus. The stuff that Nietzsche says about master and slave morality on the surface sounds reminiscent of what Thrasymachus is saying about the morality of the strong and the morality of the weak. And there is a tendency in Nietzsche, he was a classicist, for him not to mention the obvious sources of some of the ideas that he claims to have invented himself, by the way. Brenda, society moving in cycles between tyranny and democracy, kind of what you were talking about. And yeah, I haven't really got time to develop that idea, but I feel I mentioned in the article that that's part of what comes out of that discussion, really. How is the just man stronger than the unjust man? Surely there must be some sense in which the unjust is potentially stronger. They gain ascendancy at certain points. Melville, relevance of Thrasymachus to the current political scene? Yeah, no comment. You know, maybe there are traces of that. There are people connected to the current political debate who even write books saying stuff that sounds like Thrasymachus. Brenda, Socrates is right to separate personal gain from the art of rule. Yeah, like this is the interesting kind of technical question that he's making. Maybe that loses some. You don't have to agree with everything he says or pick up on every point, but you know, sometimes it's just the overall theme that's interesting. But this is the real gist of his technical point. There's a distinction between these two kind of functions or roles, and Thrasymachus is conflating them together. And this argument, this kind of this theming argument, recurs in Greek philosophy. You know, that's another reason that these things are important, because you'll find this in the Stoics as well, cropping up in different forms. The idea that sometimes people confuse two different roles, and they're distinct because those roles have fundamentally different goals. And so, you know, you're kind of trying to mix two things that don't necessarily go together. Like actually in the New Testament where it says you cannot serve both God and mammon. Epictetus says you can't mount two horses at the same time. So this idea that often people are trying to combine two things that just don't go together. And they don't go together because their underlying goals are in conflict. But that's such a fundamental argument that applies across the board to lots of different things that are worthy of discussion. It's a shame not to spend more time on it, but like just bringing it to your awareness. The excerpt, Socrates' friends reacting to his sentence. So I don't know, I wonder whether some people I find kind of become less sympathetic to Socrates as they learn more about him, and then other people like started off kind of, you know, not warming to him, gradually as they learn more become more sympathetic to him. So his friends here just don't like the way that they responded to his trial, really, and his sentence. Wilfred, capital punishment's inherently unjust. Gandhi broke unjust laws. You mentioned Socrates also kind of arguably broke laws at least twice. He didn't comply with the laws imposed by the 30 tyrants, interestingly. On at least two occasions. Once where he refused to go and get that guy Leo Salamis to have him executed, and the other time where they banned him from doing philosophy, and he apparently just ignored that. And the way he responded, I think, was to basically argue that the laws weren't valid because they were contradictory, which is, we don't kind of really see enough of that, but it sounds like that was part of his rationale. Michael N says Socrates comes across as a sort of martyr for philosophy. Yeah, very much so. Unafraid of dying because he had a full life and was old. That's part of it. I think also when people are evaluating this, the way that he dies, the thing is that there are clearly multiple layers to that, and that's one of them that sometimes people overlook. He was at least 70, possibly a bit older, and bearing in mind that in Greek society at the time, that's exceptionally old. There were some people that lived to that age, but I don't know what the average life expectancy I would have thought would maybe be mid-30s or something. I need to go and check that. It's off the top of my head, but it would be pretty young, right? Like, they didn't have a lot of medicine, and there are bandits and stuff. Like, there are lots of things that can kill you. So he's over 70, so it's pretty old, and you know, life wasn't easy. A part of that also he mentions in passing is this idea of going to sort of debtor's prison. If he paid a huge fine, he'd have to go to prison anyway because he wouldn't have the money to settle the fine. And you know, what would his quality of life be like in an Athenian prison, which is probably pretty rough as a 71, 72-year-old guy? Probably wouldn't have been very easy. Michael S. Socrates ridicules the jury by demanding to be paid free meals. I'm going to question that a little bit because that's not entirely what he says. That's kind of, I'd say that's partially true. But if you look closely at the apology, what he actually does, it's more like he's kind of mentioning that in passing and thinking out loud before the jury. He does say it to them, allegedly. But that's not, he doesn't actually propose that to them as the sentence if you look closely. So he kind of muses about that, and then he proposes to pay 1 mina, which, you know, wasn't enough really for that kind of sentence. but nevertheless that he does propose to pay a fine. 2 of his students were among the 30 tyrants. Yeah, I mean, again, that's a sort of half-truth. Like, nobody's really sure how to interpret that. I.F. Stone wrote a book where he really emphasises that aspect of Socrates. He takes quite a very partisan, very biased approach, but definitely worth reading, as long as you bear in mind it's not as balanced as the way that other people normally read things. About his life. 2 of his students were members of 30 Tyrants. They probably dissociated themselves from him a long time ago, though, and during the oligarchy, the reign of the 30 Tyrants, most of the stories indicate that Socrates was pretty uncooperative with them and was seen as a bit of an agitator. Nevertheless, many common Athenians may have thought he knew those guys, he's still tainted somehow. Did he have Spartan sympathies? I don't think there's many indications he actually had political sympathies with the Spartans, but he is satirized for being associated with Sparta. His followers dress and wear their hair like Spartans. Doesn't necessarily mean that they agree with Spartan politics, though. Melville, Greek view of reason itself is divine. That certainly is a theme. Bob, Socrates shuts down Hermogenes by appealing to his divine sign. Yeah, that does seem like a little bit, if he really believes that he has this divine conscience-like inner voice, then he seems to believe it. Understands grief being magnified by unjustness, or he doesn't understand questions that. I know somebody had said that this thing about the worst thing is that you're being punished unjustly. Is it Apollodorus that says that? Apollodorus. He and Socrates said, would you rather maybe be punished justly? That makes perfect sense to me, actually. But maybe not everybody reads it the same way. Brenda wonders if Socrates would have made the same decision in court 30 years earlier. Who knows? But he would have made a similar decision under the 30 Tyrants, which is 3 or 4 years earlier. We see him kind of little tiny snippets of vignettes about him being faced with execution. Also, the following the Battle of Arginusae, we see him being threatened with impeachment, imprisonment, and death, and him still acting in the same kind of obstinate way. Then we have the exercise, cultivating the value of friendship. Just touch on that briefly. Brenda said, Socrates imply that we should have lots of friends. I don't think he really means that you should just have lots of superficial friendships. He means that you should improve the quality of the friendships that you have, and also you should aim to have as many friends as possible. So Socrates had lots of friends and very close friendships. It's a popularity contest. It's not. Clearly, that's not what he's talking about, because a popularity contest obviously would just be trying to have more friends than other people and possibly kind of superficial friendships. He's clearly not talking about that. He's talking about having genuine friendships. It's the quality that matters. Michael N, challenging content this week. Some people are natural loners. Yeah, I'm not sure so much what to say about that. That's true. Socrates doesn't really seem to touch on this idea that maybe some people just aren't as sociable as others. They're more introverted, and that's natural. It may just be the personality type. Then again, what he really is talking about is the goal is virtue. So the goal is exhibiting friendship more than necessarily winning friends. I guess that's what he'd say. Maybe that doesn't come out in all of the dialogues, though. Wilfred, can't understand what qualities would make someone a bad friend. I can think of... it depends how you define friend. If we're talking about friend in the strong sense of the word, a genuine friend, yeah, but most of the people in the world have friends that aren't necessarily great for them. Being a good friend, being a good person, then friendship will follow. Yeah, Socrates would agree with that. Michael S, using a journal, finds that very helpful. Melville says it's a hard exercise. Hasn't thought about friendship in this depth. Yeah, it's meant to be difficult. So Socrates would say, well, that's an indication that it might be useful to spend more time on it. Found it useful to put a monetary value on his own friendship. It's interesting that some people thought that was kind of a difficult idea. I thought it would be challenging, then other people say, yeah, this is useful, I can relate to it. Fundamentally, it's not really that different from just putting a numerical rating on it, which is something we do all the time in therapy. Friendships have kind of been hijacked by social media. Yeah. Then at the end, in the what next section, Michael N said, found this week extremely helpful. Some parts had to be reread because they're a bit esoteric. Yeah, I wanted to say something in general about that. Like, one of my challenges in writing this course is to make it simple enough. If you, but not to kind of distort the arguments or oversimplify it. So the challenge is simplifying things but not oversimplifying them. Like, that's not easy. And so I've tried to do that as best I can. I think I've done it reasonably well in most of the sections. There's one or two where I'd like to go back and revisit them and see if I can kind of abbreviate them, simplify them a little bit more. And I've got some other ideas about ways that can be done, perhaps by introducing diagrams and stuff. But if you go and look at some of the original dialogues, then you'll see there are bits that I've left out, there are bits that I've compressed. Like, and hopefully, you know, what you have in this course is a more accessible version. Like, there are dialogues that people I think would read and just get nothing out of unless they read an introduction like this first, that makes it clearer what the reasoning actually is, and introduces some comments as well to try and make it more accessible. Wilfred, Thrasymachus was too esoteric. Questions I wasn't asking, but are those questions that other people are asking, though, like people around you, maybe your friends and associates, like, are, you know, thinking in those terms? We'd like to discuss more about just society, but I think Wilfred also mentions that actually Socrates doesn't say that much about just society except in the latter books, or the following 9 books of Plato's Republic, which to a large extent are considered to reflect Plato's views more. So that's kind of inevitably a part of the Socratic literature that we've left out in this course, because we're trying to focus more on Socrates than on Plato. But maybe I can bring more of that in later. Then again, I think most of the people that are doing this said what they were really interested in was how these questions relate to their own relationships rather than, you know, like politics and society in general. And also what Plato says is not deemed that helpful by a lot of people, I think, because of its sort of totalitarian nature. That would maybe, it ends up becoming inevitably, I think, a much more academic like thing if we get into what the Republic says about society. I think it gets further removed away from psychology, basically, although there's meant to be a psychological dimension to it. Brenda, substitute mother, sister for friend. Yeah, he's doing that. In the Heracrates, Lamprocles, like, he's talking about our family relationships as friendships. Found discussions with Polemarchus and Thrasymachus excellent. Good. It's like, even I'm kind of hoping that even some of the people that didn't like those discussions, like 10 years later, will still think, oh, it's annoying. I can still remember that thing that Thrasymachus said. Like, you know, when I first read some of these dialogues, it didn't immediately click with me, and then years later I found that I was still kind of thinking about them, and then it's taken me a long time to, you know, appreciate them in the way that I do, like 30 years or something, I think. You know, they've grown on me, and I've felt that I've got more out of them. So, you know, I'm not too bothered if people read some of these things and think, I don't immediately take to this idea or this argument, because Socrates has this quality of kind of sticking with you. In one of the dialogues, I think it might be the Alcibiades of Aeschines. I think it's in this fragment that we have. There's this weird metaphor that one of his students uses to say that when you've been talking to Socrates, it's kind of like you've been bitten by a mosquito or some small insect and you don't notice it happening, and then afterwards you've got like a kind of irritation or a swelling, you think, oh, something must have bit me earlier. And he compares this to having conversations with Socrates. So at the time you kind of think, I don't really notice anything like coming out of this, and then afterwards you notice that something has changed in your thinking. Right. So people talk about this idea that he kind of gets under your skin without you necessarily realizing it at the time. That's what I found. Bonus material, the stuff about Socrates and Lamprocles, it kind of relates to friendship and parenting, Xanthopy features in it. And then there's all this stuff there about Critias and the 30 Tyrants. I wanted to write that because when people discuss this, there's all this stuff about Socrates being kind of pro-Spartan. There's some truth in that, but when you actually look at what we're told, the picture that's painted of how he behaved under the oligarchy, have a look at it. Like, just look at what Xenophon and to some extent Plato say about that. He does not paint a picture of Socrates. Plato collaborated with the oligarchy, and then he repented of that. Socrates, as far as because he never did, and was just a constant thorn in their side. So, it's worth looking at that. I think I tried to condense all that information into the article to give you a more rounded perception of what actually went on during those 8 months. How did Socrates actually behave under a tyranny, like under a really oppressive political regime that was carrying out mass executions and stuff like that? How would Socrates deal with the Nazis or something? Like, what did he do in this regime? Well, he didn't collaborate with it. Like, they kept threatening to kill him, in fact. Okay, so we've got about 15 minutes to look at week 4, but that's okay. I'm just going to go through it pretty briefly. Judith, so far I feel Socrates is more about method, questioning, defining than about conclusions. Yeah, basically, he does have a philosophy. He has a set of philosophical values. He has a kind of positive philosophy, but he, certainly compared to something like the Stoics, he's much more interested in getting people to think for themselves. And nevertheless, there are some positive doctrines in there. Mainly that he thinks virtue is the most important thing in life, and we should never sacrifice it for wealth and other externals, which is obviously very similar to the Stoics. Okay, so week 4, courage and death. So this is focusing on courage. The clearest example of what Socrates means when he's talking about courage comes from what we know about his own execution and other situations where he faced death. It's important that he compares courage in the courtroom to courage in other walks of life. I think that's an important part of his argument. In the courtroom, in politics, in military service, and I'll come back to that. The first video is about the Apology. So the Apology is a masterpiece. It's one of the finest pieces of philosophical literature ever written. Having said that, there'll be some people that probably read it and think, yeah, I don't really like it, but it's a classic. It's, it's I think, Plato's best piece of writing, maybe that in the Symposium, personally. And it's not very long either, which is always, good in my books. It's fairly short, so people can read it even if they're not big readers, and again, it'll stay with you, and when you go back and reread it, you'll find there's layer upon layer to what's going on in it. But in that, it's meant to be his defence speech mainly, and then some other dialogue. But there's a lot of stuff in the Apology about death and courage, particularly Socrates addressing these issues. Interestingly, it's used as an opportunity to do that. So a big part of it is, I don't know, like, this seems to be something that people relate to. It's interesting, and other people might think, I don't really see why this is relevant. But a big part of his argument in the Apology is he says people are going to think it's weird that I'm risking my life because I believe in truth and justice, and I want to speak honestly rather than giving a normal defence speech. They're probably going to think I'm crazy or obstinate or whatever. They're going to think it's an odd thing to do. And then he says, but I was in the army for a long time, and I would never have considered throwing down my weapons and surrendering myself to the enemy just to save my own skin. And he talks about this idea in the Athenian military of death before dishonour, and how, you know, even the jurors would, like, the military heroes that they admire are people that have exhibited those qualities. He said, this is what I was trained to do in the army. You know, I don't, like, run away. I don't throw my weapons down just because, like, you know, I'm risking my life. I'm used to doing this. And he says, you know, basically the subtext is now, you know, that was to protect Athens. Now, you know, I'm doing this also to protect Athens, you know, because I want to speak the truth about justice and about philosophy. This is equally as important to me, you know. So just because you guys are threatening to execute me, it would be as cowardly for me now to, you know, throw myself down on the ground, start weeping for mercy, as it would if I did that on the battlefield. You don't think I was a coward if I did that, you know, and yet you seem to think it's appropriate to do it in the law court. That's how he begins the argument, whether you agree with him or not. One of the themes in here, I don't know, it's really that explicitly stated, is in other dialogues. It's a Socratic paradox that he believes that inflicting injustice on others is worse than suffering it yourself. And that's certainly a theme in the Apology. That's partly why he's not particularly bothered, strangely indifferent. He introduces this argument, which is really one of the key things, that, you know, how can he be courageous? Partly it's because he doesn't think that death is an inherent evil. So he says, like, death is either oblivion and unconsciousness, or there's an afterlife, and those are the two options that he considers. So it's a simplified argument. He says if it's oblivion, then there's nothing to be scared of. Like, we're oblivious when we sleep deeply and we don't dream. Nobody's frightened of that. In fact, people think those are the best night's sleep that they've had. It's something, you know, quite the contrary. People enjoy that. You know, they don't think of it as a negative thing. He doesn't develop these arguments very well, but it's clear, like, you know, he's saying this is his reasoning. If there's an afterlife, again, you might think, well, it could be horrible, but his assumption is, well, probably in the afterlife I'll be able to carry on doing philosophy, talking to the souls of dead heroes and stuff. And there's more to that, I think, than meets the eye as well. It's part of this idea that philosophy, if that's something that you cherish and love, then you can gain enjoyment from it in, you know, virtually any situation. Socrates felt that he was carrying on doing philosophy under the 30 tyrants, you know, like even if he lost all of his possessions and stuff, it didn't stop him from doing his favourite thing in life, and even dying, there's no reason he wouldn't be able to continue it in the afterlife, he reckons. But then the other important point, even more fundamentally than his consideration of these two options, is the fact that he doesn't know which one is true. And he talks about this idea of conceit. The Socratic method is about deflating egos, it's about puncturing arrogance, it's about showing people that they believe that they know something that in fact they don't know. And if you look closely, that's his definition of fear. Fear of death, like cowardice. It's to believe that you know something is dangerous or bad when in fact you don't really know that for sure. You're acting as if you have more certainty than you actually have. So his argument, interestingly, targets what he sees as the attitude of certainty. And so some people have seen Socrates, broadly speaking, as a kind of precursor of agnosticism. Again, there's layer upon layer of stuff going on here. He certainly presents himself as pious and believing in the gods. Interestingly, though, in the Apology, if you look closely, he doesn't really directly answer the charge of atheism. Like, he doesn't say that he believes in the state gods explicitly. He kind of scuts around it a little bit. But what he says is, look, I can't know for certain what happens after I die. I'm agnostic. I suspend judgment about it. And because I'm suspending judgment about it, it doesn't make sense for me to be afraid. That's his argument. Again, whether you agree with it or not, it's an interesting argument. Then we have an article, oddly you might think, about a very little, not very well known Socratic dialogue called the Axiochus. And it's not that well known because even as far back as Diogenes Laertius, even in the ancient world, it was generally assumed that this was spurious, that it's not a real Platonic dialogue. It was supposed to be written by Plato, somebody else wrote it, maybe, we don't know when, but you know, maybe it's assumed partly because of the content, like a century or two later. But nevertheless, it's a Socratic dialogue. and the person who wrote it had probably had access to a lot more earlier Socratic literature than we do today. So I think it merits taking it seriously. And it's interesting because it's one of the most therapeutic in orientation of the Socratic dialogues. It's often been observed that it resembles a form of Hellenistic literature called consolation literature. So normally philosophers would use philosophy to help somebody cope with bereavement, for instance, with a typical example, particularly the Stoics, to some extent Platonists like Plutarch would do this. And here we have a dialogue where Socrates is portrayed doing something similar. Socrates himself doing consolation, using philosophy as a kind of therapy with one of his friends. So it's very interesting. And it's also interesting because if you look closely, he basically just takes the arguments from the Apology and elaborates on them. So he adds quite a lot to them, whoever this guy was. Probably a member of Plato's Academy, but we can't even be sure about that. His first argument is that death is inevitable, which is often attributed to Socrates as an argument against fear of death, but not elaborated in as much detail usually as it is here. There's that anecdote in Diogenes Laertius where someone said to Socrates, "You've been sentenced to death by the Athenians," and Socrates said, "So have they, by life, by nature rather." And this is a big theme for the Epicureans and the Stoics later, that the inevitability of death provides a reason for not being particularly distressed about it. Then also this idea that death is non-existence, which takes the little bit of an argument in the Apology and develops it a lot further. Interestingly here, whoever wrote this dialogue attributes these arguments to Prodicus, the sophist, and this kind of pops up in a couple of places, the idea that Socrates had inherited a lot of ideas, like the choice of Hercules, had taken quite a bit of material from Prodicus. So one of the things he touches on here is a familiar Stoic Epicurean argument that if death is oblivion, it's going to be no different from the period before we were born, and no one feels bad about that or views it as negative. So there's a kind of contradiction there. And that unconsciousness can't involve suffering. People tend to... There's a clear example here of Axiochus himself, talking in very graphic terms about how he imagines being eaten by maggots and stuff, and how he pictures death being awful, and Socrates saying, like, that's ridiculous because you're not going to be there to experience it. Who cares what happens to your body after you're dead? And this is a theme that pops up kind of scattered throughout ancient literature. There are anecdotes relating to Diogenes the Cynic where he makes similar points. For example, this idea that, look, people, you forget that if they think that death is unconsciousness, then why should they, worry about these sort of things? It's like they can't quite get to think through the implications of their beliefs consistently. And Socrates says that here, look, you're contradicting yourself, you're being very inconsistent. There's this counter-argument, again, Axiochus gives, where he says, well, okay, so maybe death isn't suffering, but nevertheless the fact that you're losing the pleasures of life seems like a negative thing. And Socrates gives this interesting response, which you may or may not agree with. He says, what's the point in saying that, because you won't be around to suffer the loss anyway? So he said, yeah, you could view it as a negative that you had a nice thing and then you've lost it. You've lost all the potential opportunity for nice things in life, but you won't be able to grieve that because you won't exist. Which is an interesting point to make. Again, he's saying that you're not really thinking this through consistently. Then there's a short article about the Stoicism of Socrates, drawing on the Republic. Again, I'm just going to skim through this pretty briefly, but ideas that are in the Republic that we don't really see as much of in other dialogues, so they may come from Plato. They're in Book 10 of the Republic, right at the end, but they clearly resemble stuff that we find in the Stoics, and they're interesting in terms of emotional resilience and courage. So the four things he mentions are, one, that we shouldn't become overly upset about events because we can't tell for sure what's good or bad for us, what's going to turn out better or worse in the long run. Number two, grieving too much does us no good. It does us more harm than good. Number three, nothing in life is that important in the grand scheme of things anyway. And number four, grief actually inhibits problem solving. Like, we should be thinking rationally and clearly when we're faced with a crisis, and so grief is counterproductive in that sense. I'm not going to comment on that except to say that I pretty much agree with all of those points, and they all resemble points that we would potentially draw in modern cognitive therapy. Dialogue 5, the next section is the laches, or on courage. There's lots of interesting things about this. It's an early meiotic dialogue. Again, it circles around the issue. It doesn't arrive at a clear conclusion about the nature of courage, but it's interesting if you take it for what it is. And it's also interesting because we see again Socrates talking to a bunch of generals. How familiar he is with these aristocrats, it's kind of odd. And the fact that he seems very knowledgeable about military matters, which would normally be, he has the kind of knowledge you would normally expect of an officer, and he wasn't a member of the officer class, but probably because he had this unusual education. And I guess an interesting thing to say about that is that Socrates, part of the controversy about him is that he's crossing social boundaries. He's kind of like he's an educated pleb. He comes from the middle classes. Like, he's a craftsman. He's not an aristocrat, but he has this kind of high level education that would normally be associated with an Athenian aristocrat. And then he's going around and sharing that knowledge with slaves and women and, you know, foreigners, and so people saw him as kind of disrupting an aspect of the social order, I think. So here he is talking to a bunch of generals about the nature of courage. And then we've got some notes about what Socrates said about courage from Xenophon, from the Meno, from the Protagoras, from the Phaedo. So there's a lot in that section. I might simplify it later. After I did the video, I was like, yeah, it gets a little bit technical in places. Maybe this could do with being condensed and simplified a little bit more, so I moved it to the end of week 3. But, you know, there's a lot of very important, very valuable content in there, like if you can tolerate some of the slightly more intricate arguments that are going on. And then the technique, the therapy technique for this week is, I chose one that I thought fitted in neatly with the stuff that we've done before and builds on it. So it's more about targeting distress and fear, and it's a cognitive therapy approach that's Beck called alternative therapy, which was a play on words. And the technical term that's used for something similar by researchers is generation of alternatives. So the idea is that you would use structured questions to develop different ways of thinking about or looking at distressing situations. And to do that, you have to think of a distressing situation. So there's guidance in there about how to do that appropriately. And that's absolutely fundamental. Like, if you skimp on that, then you won't really benefit from this technique. So it's important to think about finding appropriate targets and look very closely at the guidance that I give in there about doing that. And so there's a little bit about brainstorming alternatives, a little bit about functional analysis in there. I'm not going to go deeper into it now because we don't really have time, but it's similar in style to some of the values clarification stuff. But rather than being questions aimed at clarifying your values, they're questions aimed at reappraising how catastrophic a threatening situation is or how distressing a situation is. So hopefully you'll see the similarity to things that are in the Socratic literature, although Socrates doesn't give us a methodology for doing this, so this is not something that Socrates does. Nevertheless, some of these individual questions you'll see kind of broadly resemble some of the questions that we've touched on in this part of the course. And then the excerpt I wanted to discuss is the death scene from the Phaedo, which is just a very powerful and moving scene, or it could be frustrating if you think Socrates is being an idiot, but it's certainly a very important scene in understanding his life. It's one that really stands out from Plato's writings. And then the bonus section I've included from Diogenes Laertius, just for your reference, a system from the ancient world that was used to classify the Platonic dialogues. And then there's an article that I just wrote recently because it seemed kind of topical. And one of Xenophon's dialogues is about immigrants or refugees rather, probably during the 30 Tyrants, and how Socrates gives advice to one of his friends about dealing with refugees in his household by finding them appropriate work to do. Just that it's a good example of Socrates giving someone real, tangible, practical advice, like genuinely trying to help people, and how he approached that. I just think it's an interesting little example. So that is everything today. It was pretty much an hour. I only went over 5 minutes. Hope that was helpful. At Donald, do you think Socrates was advocating being cosmopolitan like the Stoics were? It's hard to say. I mean, some ancient commentators say that it was Socrates who said that. I believe actually Epictetus attributes this phrase of being a citizen of the cosmos to Socrates. I think it's more commonly attributed to Diogenes the Cynic, but some people, I think Epictetus being one of them, attribute it to Socrates. It would be consistent with the other stuff that he says, although in other places he talks about the tremendous value he places on his fellow citizens and his family. So, there's this tension in ancient philosophy between whether we should treat everyone else as an equal, or whether, like Hierocles, there should be kind of concentric circles, and it's natural to place more value on our family and our fellow citizens and so on, and then kind of radiate out from that to treat people that are less familiar to us with, in some respects, slightly less consideration or natural affection. Socrates does seem biased in favour of Athens, it's fair to say, but in Athenian society he hangs around with a lot of immigrants and women and slaves and all a real mixture of people, so that would have been seen, I think, by many people as making him very cosmopolitan and broad-minded. Yeah, like it would be fair to say he comes across as a cosmopolitan guy in that respect. Like, he has a real mixture of a diverse mixture of friends and associates. Maternal mortality during childbirth was high. Yeah, this is true. I mean, one of the things that biases the mean life expectancy is a lot of people died in childhood. There were in infancy, and a lot of mothers died. I think female life expectancy is lower than male because of the dangers associated with childbirth. And so, if you make it beyond a certain point, you're likely to live longer. But even so, being over 70 is not particularly common. There are certainly some people that make it to that age, but he was old, and he didn't have access to sort of healthcare that we do. So the health problems that he would have potentially had to live with at that age would have been harder for him to deal with, because medicine. Xenophon seemed to move over to the Spartan side. Yeah, I mean, so did Alcibiades. Betrayed Athens. So that there's an argument that these. I mean, also there's a lot of speculation about Xenophon as well, and where his allegiances were at different points. But then we are told these stories about Socrates that show him being pretty unfriendly towards the pro-Spartan oligarchy. And Diogenes Laertius claims that Socrates straight up claims that Socrates was a Democrat, which is interesting. Aristophanes kind of portrays he and his associates as being Sparta mad, as he puts it. So maybe there's conflicting interpretations. So one of those guys comes centuries later, so maybe is unreliable in that respect. The other one is a contemporary of him, but he's a satirist. So how much can we trust what he's saying? Welcome to studying classics, right? It's mess. So yeah, it's like the Da Vinci Code or something. Like there's all these little clues, and you can kind of try and piece them together into a story. But it's possible to impose different interpretations on the information that we have surviving. But I do think if you lay out what we're told about the 30 Tyrants, it's worth looking at that as a whole and the picture that it paints. That said, you might say that a lot of that's confabulated. Maybe Xenophon and Plato were attempting to portray Socrates in a particular way. Okay, that will do for today. I think that's all of the questions. Thanks very much for tuning in, and I hope that you enjoyed the course, and I'll be in touch. I'll be sending out some follow-up questionnaires, so it'll be interesting to get your feedback from that. And also I'll put out something kind of commenting on some of the questions that people put in the feedback forms. There's not a lot, but there might be a few things about course design and stuff worth me mentioning. So goodbye, and I hope that I get to chat with some of you again in the future. I'll be reading the comments that you continue to post on this part of the course, and I hope that you enjoy week 4. Cheers then. Bye bye.